On a November morning in 1983, in a quiet village in Leicestershire, England, a 15-year-old girl named Linda Mann was found murdered on a footpath. And for 3 years, her killer walked free, leaving behind nothing but grief and a case that seemed destined to go cold forever. Then, in 1986, a second girl was killed in nearly identical circumstances, and investigators found themselves staring at the same terrifying dead end. There were no witnesses. There was no confession. There was only a single, almost invisible trace of biological evidence left behind at each scene, and no way, at that point in history, to make it. The University of Leicester, he was studying patterns in human genetic material, looking for a way to trace inherited traits through families. What he stumbled upon instead was something far bigger, a method for creating what he called a genetic fingerprint, a pattern within a person's DNA so specific, so individually unique, that no two people on Earth, aside from identical twins, would ever share the same one. At the time, Jeffries understood he had made a scientific breakthrough. What he didn't yet know was that police just down the road were sitting on a case that would become its first real-world test. When investigators approached him about the Leicestershire murders, they were asking him to do something that had never been done before in the history of criminal justice. Use invisible molecular evidence to either identify a killer or clear an innocent man already in custody who had falsely confessed under pressure. The results stunned everyone. The DNA proved the suspect in custody was innocent and he was released, the first person in history, exonerated by genetic evidence. But it also proved something else, that the same still unidentified killer had committed both murders. With no match yet to charge, investigators tried something audacious. They asked every man in the surrounding villages, more than 4,000 of them, to voluntarily provide a blood sample, launching the first mass DNA screening in history. Month after month passed with no match, until a woman overheard a colleague at a local bakery boasting that he had given a blood sample under someone else's name, impersonating a friend to avoid being tested himself. That single overheard conversation led police to Colin Pitchfork, a baker who, when finally tested under his real identity, matched the DNA from both crime scenes perfectly. He was convicted in 1988, and criminal justice had permanently changed. A tool once confined to research laboratories had proven it could do something no fingerprint, no eyewitness, and no confession ever fully could. Identify a person with a level of certainty approaching mathematical proof. For the next 3 decades, DNA evidence would go on to solve tens of thousands of cases, but it also revealed a darker, more troubling side of the justice system it had helped modernize. As DNA testing improved, old evidence, sometimes decades old, sitting forgotten in police storage rooms, could suddenly be retested with far greater precision than the technology available at the time of the original trial. What investigators found, again and again, was devastating. Innocent people, convicted on the strength of eyewitness testimony or bite mark analysis or hair comparison, techniques once considered rock solid, were walking free after DNA proved they could not have committed the crimes that had cost them decades of their lives. Entire projects were built around this single mission, combing through old convictions. And the numbers grew into the hundreds, then close to 1,000 exonerations, a sobering reminder that the same science capable of identifying the guilty was equally capable of proving the system had gotten it catastrophically wrong. But even with all of that power, DNA evidence had one persistent limitation that haunted investigators for years. It could only solve a case if the perpetrator's genetic profile already existed somewhere in a database, waiting to be matched. If a killer had never been arrested before, never had their DNA collected, the evidence at the scene became a fingerprint with no name attached to it, a perfect answer to a question no one could ask. For decades, that was where thousands of cases stalled, cold cases piling up in evidence lockers across the country. The killer's genetic signature sitting right there in cold storage, unreachable. Then, in April of 2018, that limitation collapsed overnight, and it happened not because of a new government database, but because of ordinary people uploading their own DNA to consumer genealogy websites in search of long-lost relatives. For more than 40 years, a man known only as the Golden State Killer had terrorized California, responsible for a horrifying string of rapes and murders across the 1970s and 1980s, and despite decades of effort, investigators had never identified him. Then, a team of investigators took the killer's crime scene DNA and uploaded it, not to a law enforcement database, but to a public genealogy platform designed for people building their family trees. The system didn't return a direct match. Instead, it returned distant cousins, third and fourth cousins the suspect had never met and didn't even know existed. From there, investigators did something that looked less like forensic science and more like painstaking historical detective work. They built out enormous family trees branching backward through generations, cross-referencing age, location, and physical descriptions, narrowing a pool of distant relatives down, generation by generation, until only one name remained. In April of 2018, 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer, was arrested in his own driveway, ending a hunt that had spanned more than 4 decades and touched thousands of lives. The technique became known as investigative genetic genealogy. And it didn't just solve one impossible case. It cracked open a method that would go on to identify perpetrators and victims in hundreds of cases that had sat frozen for years, sometimes for half a century. What makes this story so extraordinary isn't just the science itself, remarkable as it is. It's the strange, almost poetic irony sitting at the center of it. The breakthrough that finally cracked cases the size of the Golden State Killers didn't come from a government laboratory or a classified program. It came from ordinary families, spitting into plastic tubes and mailing them off in search of nothing more than their own ancestry, never imagining that the same strand of genetic code connecting them to a great-great-grandparent could one day connect investigators to a killer they'd never met. Every one of us carries within our own cells a record stretching back through every ancestor who came before us. And it turns out that record can be read not just forward, tracing who we are, but backward, tracing who among our relatives did something they thought no one would ever be able to prove. Today, that same genetic architecture, first glimpsed by a curious scientist in an English laboratory in 1984, continues to work quietly in labs around the world, reopening cases once given up for lost, giving names back to unidentified victims, and reminding a new generation of investigators that no matter how much time has passed, evidence written into the molecule of life itself does not disappear, and it does not lie. And eventually, for good or for justice, it tends to be found.